Zionism's champions have always regarded it as a struggle for self-determination, not the denial of the same to others. A large-scale concerted uprising against that forward-marching tale seems an unwelcome disruption in the narrative arc. Since the early days of the Zionist movement, Palestinian intellectuals and political figures perceived that Zionism had objectives that could be achieved only at the expense of Palestinian aspirations, whether framed in Ottoman, Muslim or Christian, Arab, Syrian, or narrowly Palestinian terms, and they too generally came to hold a zero-sum view of the conflict. In the aftermath of the Great War, the British and French took on the thankless job of trying to establish modern, Western-style states in the Middle East, with varying levels of success and compliance. Additionally, they were trying to keep a bevy of promises made to various parties in the region, and nowhere were these promises more troubling than in the Mandate Palestine. They had made promises to the Arabs about a great federation encompassing most of the Arab world. They had also promised the Jews the creation of a national home for them in Palestine. And by 1936, they hadn't fulfilled their promise to either party. Jews from across Europe had begun immigrating to Palestine, bringing wealth and expertise to a land with an underdeveloped economy. But the Arabs were not happy when these people, who up until recently were second-class citizens, were challenging their privileged status. But the Jews didn't do themselves any favors by trying to insulate themselves economically, resulting in an unequal spread of economic growth. The Mandate government had placed restrictions on Jewish immigration based on the ability of the Jewish economy to support them, but they would later change the formulation and base it on Arab employment levels in hopes of forcing the Jews to open up their economy more to the Arabs, thus more widely spreading the benefits of Jewish immigration. The Jewish Agency was in constant negotiations with the British over immigration permits. The demand was greater than the supply, so many Jews immigrated to Palestine illegally. Most of the illegal residents were Jews who entered the country on a tourist visa and then overstayed. Jewish women would marry a legal Jewish resident of Palestine in order to stay. German immigrants were of particular interest to the agency. Not only were German Jews under the most immediate threat from the Nazis, but they tended to have more money than those coming from Eastern Europe. Jewish immigration had soared in the 1930s thanks to the rise of the Nazis, and it became a double-edged sword for the Zionists. It sped up the process of Jewish immigration to Palestine, but this sudden rise in Jewish population alarmed the Arabs into violent reaction. These tensions were being fueled with religious fervor by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Hussaini, who was the head of the Supreme Muslim Council, which controlled all of the religious sites for Muslims in Palestine. Amin used his position to spread Islamist and anti-Semitic propaganda, intentionally radicalizing the Arab population and trying to make the Palestinian cause a global issue. At one point, Ben-Gurion would say the cause of the conflict was the violent doctrine of Islam. On April 15th, a gang of Arab bandits were robbing drivers along the road between Nablus and Tulkarm to raise money to fund an armed uprising. When they pulled Jews over, they forced them to park off to the side of the road, and when they couldn't get additional money from them, one Jew, Israel Hassan, was shot dead. He would become the first victim of the 1936 Arab Revolt in Palestine. News of this reached Jewish communities that began to print books, pamphlets, and posters with photos of Hassan, calling him the first victim. Jewish newspapers were horrified at the story, but they reported it as a mere act of banditry, rather than the prelude to a rebellion. And like previous unprovoked acts of violence against the Jews of Palestine, this act sparked retaliation. 2 armed Jews near Petah Tikva killed 2 Arab orchard workers, which was followed up by additional violence from the Jewish community. After the funeral of Israel Hassan, a crowd of 100 began marching south toward Jaffa. The British feared another riot would ensue and confronted the crowds with batons. In the following days, Arabs living in Tel Aviv complained to police about harassment and assault by Jews. One recorded instance saw an Arab horse cab driver with a Jewish customer get surrounded by young Jews shouting at them in German.
Jewish blood is shed, and you're traveling in an Arab cart. Und Blood und Fire Judea fell. Und Blood und Fire Judea shall rise.
Rumors spread throughout the Arab community that another of the 3 Jews shot by the bandits had died, and that the Jews were planning another public funeral. Additional rumors alleged that the Jews were on a murdering spree across Tel Aviv and Jaffa. On the morning of Sunday, April 19th, a crowd of Arabs surrounded the Jaffa District Commissioner's office, demanding to see the bodies, despite both the commissioner and the local imam telling them that there weren't any. The crowd didn't believe them. The rumors led to sporadic assaults and murders of Jews around Jaffa. When Jewish police tried to respond, they were murdered by the Arab mobs, while Arab and British police were reported to have stood by and let the assaults happen. Most of the victims were not shot, but rather beaten to death with hammers, clubs, and fists. Some Arabs rescued assaulted Jews or helped them escape from Jaffa, but they were tragically outnumbered by those who engaged in violence. Some Jews in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem retaliated the next morning, damaging local Arab property and throwing stones at cars headed toward Jaffa, presuming there was an Arab behind the wheel. Arab laborers from Syria set fire to the Yemenite quarter of Tel Aviv, which was filled with wooden shantytowns and narrow alleys. And a number of these Jewish deaths were people who had survived pogroms in Ukraine 20 years earlier. Again, Jewish newspapers decried the assaults. The Palestine Post would say, "The riot's gravest implication? Contempt for human life which it revealed among, we hope, only the scum of Jaffa's population." Arab newspapers played down the higher Jewish death toll and focused on the 2 Arabs killed by the police. David Ben-Gurion would also blame the revolt on Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. This event was the cause, directly and indirectly, of the riots that erupted in Jaffa on April 10, 1936. They were then spread through the country by agents of the Mufti, aided by Mussolini and Hitler. The riots and international powers behind them caused the British government to abrogate the Balfour Declaration and renounce the obligations it had assumed under the terms of the Mandate. The British aimed to make the land of Israel an Arab state under their control. Ben-Gurion also seems to blame communists for inciting the riots in 1936. In a speech he gave to the Histadrut in February of 1937, he would say, "Who knows what would have happened to the Yishuv had these riots, promoted by outside elements, both communist and fascist, with the aid of the Arab kings and of Arab bands in Syria and Iraq, broken out not in 1936, when the Yishuv have already numbered 400,000, but 5 or 6 years earlier. Who knows how they would have ended in that case?" Okay, so I did a little digging, and I'm not entirely sure who he's referring to when he says communists. Is he accusing the Soviet Union of fomenting the Jaffa riots, or maybe he's accusing European communist parties? Or perhaps he's just accusing the non-Palestinian Arabs working in the Mandate, which is something you don't usually hear about too much. Anyways, I am unfamiliar with much Soviet involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict prior to 1948, so if anyone can enlighten me on what he's referring to, let me know down in the comments below. Anyways, the riots in the cities would spill into the countryside as bands of people formed to attack local Jewish settlers and British outposts. But these bands were not organized, at least not at first, which is a consequence of the long-standing rivalry between the Arab notables. Palestine's Arab leaders during the first 2 decades of British rule in Palestine did not act as a cohesive political elite, failed to balance between the demands they made and the power they possessed, nor were they astute in assessing the resolve of the imperial power to hold on to Palestine. The Arab guerrillas tended to be in their late teens or early 20s, and they had various motivations and backgrounds. Some were religiously motivated, others were political nationalists, and others were those who had criminal records and were already wanted by law enforcement, and quite a few were all 3 in 1. They received food and other aid from Arab villages, sometimes voluntarily, but often through violent intimidation. They mostly engaged in hit-and-run attacks, engaging in open combat sparingly. The attacks grew so frequent that the British had to transport supplies in heavily defended convoys. The Mandate government declared a state of emergency, occupying empty buildings, imposing curfews, censoring letters in the press, arresting without warrant and deporting foreign rioters, while soldiers were sent to augment police in Jaffa. They arrested Arabs for engaging in violence, rioting, and incitement, along with at least 50 Jews who were suspected of taking up arms. Taxis and buses were commandeered by Jerusalem authorities in case they saw a flood of Jewish refugees fleeing their towns and villages. The entire Jewish populations of Hebron and Beersheba would be transferred to Jerusalem, but the violence only escalated. While the streets of Jaffa were erupting in violence, Jewish and Arab leaders met to negotiate the establishment of a legislature for Palestine. David Ben-Gurion from the Jewish Agency was arguing with George Antonius about the formula for apportionment, as well as who was the true aggressor in the conflict. George Antonius was a Lebanese Christian who embraced Arab nationalism as an alternative unifying force for the Arab world over Islam. Similar to Musa Alami, he was educated at Cambridge and joined the Mandate civil service in the 1920s. He served as a translator for the British government when negotiating the borders between Iraq, Jordan, and Yemen with the newly formed Saudi Arabia. He also moonlighted as a journalist and scholar, eventually publishing his magnum opus, The Arab Awakening, in 1938. In his arguments with Ben-Gurion, he complained about the Jews lobbying against the Arab-dominated Legislative Council in London. Chaim Weizmann had led the charge against the Legislative Council, who at the time saw it as a bigger threat to Zionism than Arab violence. Appeasement of the Arabs did not at first take the form of limitation of Jewish immigration. It took, instead, a form which, if allowed to develop, would have led to the complete arrest of both Jewish immigration and of Jewish progress generally, namely, British advocacy of a legislative council with Arabs in the majority. Weizmann would advise High Commissioner Walkup on the issue. Talk of elected Arabs representing their people was to contradict the democratic principle which it was supposed to further. A legislative council in Palestine would be merely a modernized cloak for the old feudal system. Ben-Gurion, however, was in agreement with the Arabs in believing that immigration was the biggest issue. Every day the ships bombard us with hundreds of Jewish immigrants. If this immigration continues, Palestine's future is very black. There is no choice but to rouse ourselves. There is no choice but to shake ourselves. There is no choice but to act. George Antonius asserted that the Jews were the true aggressor of the conflict, and asserted that the Jews were the true aggressors of the conflict in Palestine. Ben-Gurion refused to consider limitations on Jewish immigration for any reason but economic, while the Arabs refused to accept the Jews as a legitimate presence in Palestine. They met again in the aftermath of the Jaffa riots. Antonius asked why the Jews insisted on political Zionism instead of making Palestine a spiritual center. Ben-Gurion responds that many Jews in Europe had secularized, but were still persecuted by the Christians, and thus they needed to live somewhere else, not just appoint it as their spiritual North Star. Antonius proposed to Ben-Gurion an Arab federation with an autonomous Jewish majority province. It would stretch from Gaza to Haifa and into the Jezreel Valley, with the remainder of the mandate belonging to an Arab majority Palestine. Ben-Gurion had made a similar proposal to Musa Alami 2 years earlier, but Arab intransigence had taken its toll. He rejected any plan that involved a federation with Syria, and giving up half of Palestine was a no-go. A few days later, Antonius left for a visit to Turkey and would never see Ben-Gurion again. But the bridges to both Musa Alami and George Antonius burnt. There were no remaining Arab moderates whom Ben-Gurion could trust to negotiate with. Luckily for me, I can still talk to you about this video's sponsor, Magic Spoon. But first, a little movie magic to make me grow a beard. Luckily for me, I can still talk to you about this video's sponsor, Magic Spoon. If you're an adult like me, chances are it's been a while since you've eaten a bowl of cereal. But most of the cereals you'll see in the grocery store aisle have tons of sugar and are not the best for you. Over the last year, I have started taking my health very seriously, and the most important part of your health is, well, what you eat. And let me tell you, Magic Spoon is an excellent addition to a low-carb diet, such as mine, since I chose keto. Magic Spoon cereal is high in protein, gluten and grain-free, with natural flavors, and 0 grams of sugar. And for a kick of nostalgia, they have replicated a bunch of your favorite cereal flavors, such as frosted, fruity, cocoa, and peanut butter, which is my personal favorite. Real talk for a minute, so I have absolutely fallen in love with this stuff. It's like Magic Spoon sent me a variety pack in order to try out and, of course, use for filming in the videos. But I liked it so much that I ran out of one of the cereals, so I had to go down to my local Target and pick up another box just to film with. But luckily, you don't have to go to a brick and mortar store to buy the cereal, because you can have it sent directly to your door. You can have a variety box delivered straight to your home by clicking the top link in the description, by scanning this QR code on screen, or by going to magicspoon.com/casual. And if you use the promo code CASUAL at checkout, you get $5 off any order. So what are you waiting for? A delicious addition to your adult, health-conscious lifestyle is available at magicspoon.com/casualhistorian. Thanks again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. There we go. Continuity restored. Anyways, on April 19, 1936, a nationalist conference was held in Nablus, which called for a general strike and formed a national committee, all the while Arab mobs murdered 9 Jews in Jaffa and injured another 57. Similar events played out in other towns. Now, at first, the Mufti actually tried to stop the riots. Now, it's not that he didn't support the use of violence against the British and the Jews, no, far from it. He just thought that this was an inopportune time for it, rather than being against the idea in general. While negotiations between the moderates broke down, the Grand Mufti was busy. In the early 1920s, the Mufti had been a Pan-Arabist, but by the 1930s, he saw Pan-Arabism as a failed cause and began to embrace an embryonic Palestinian nationalism, and directed all of his ire toward the British and the Jews. On April 20th, 1936, a day after the riots in Jaffa, Arab notables created the Arab National Committee, which called on Arab workers to go on strike. Chapters of the committee spread across Palestine and were more or less completely independent of each other. The riots had begun without the involvement of the notables, and so they created the committees as a way of harnessing this popular backlash for their own benefit. Representatives of the 6 Arab parties met up in Jerusalem to form the Arab Higher Committee and placed Amin as its president, and on April 25th, they proclaimed their own nationwide strike until the British met their demands. Another conference was held on May 7th, which consisted of the various Arab and Muslim committees formed around Palestine, in which Amin called Muslims around the world to support their cause, drawing comparisons to the Reconquista. In addition to the strike, the conference agreed to have Arabs stop paying taxes, and some called on government employees to join the strike. Despite it explicitly going against one of the Arab demands, land sales to Jews continued throughout the rebellion. One of the issues with land sales was that Arab landowners often rented out these lands to small Arab farmers, but the Jews had bought them with the intention of living and working the land themselves. Oftentimes, Arab tenants would refuse to leave, and thus leaving the new landowners to have to bring cases to trial, and the courts would usually find them in their favor, and so that would then result in the law enforcement of the mandate being used to forcibly evict the Arab tenants. The National Fund would often offer the old tenants other land to live on and/or financial compensation, but during the rebellion, the tenants were more resistant to being evicted, and the British couldn't spare the manpower to evict them while an active rebellion was being fought. In most cases, the tenants who accepted the offer to live on other lands or accepted compensation for being removed from their old land were usually no worse off than they were before. Arab-run stores, schools, and transportation across the country were shut down for the strike. Any business owners that didn't comply with the strike faced harassment and vandalism. Arab men were told to replace their Ottoman fez with the black and white checkered headdress, and women were told to cover their faces, including Christian Arabs and Armenians. But some Arabs resisted the committee's commands. Farmers were reluctant to let crops go unattended, and government workers feared staying home would lose them their jobs. Behind the scenes, the Mufti tried to calm things down, but at a certain point he realized he couldn't, and therefore he needed to become the face of the revolt, with his only restraint being that he did not declare it a jihad. The Supreme Muslim Council also avoided direct involvement in the strike at first, but as it continued, religious leaders began to speak out in favor of the strike and the revolt, and by the end of June, the Supreme Muslim Council was officially supporting the nationalist struggle. Publicly, Amin decried violence, but behind closed doors, he was recruiting fighters and finding funds and arms to supply them. But he still knew the Arabs of Palestine couldn't defeat the British and Zionists by themselves, so he relied on Pan-Arabists and Pan-Islamist rhetoric to obtain foreign support. In 1936, the Mufti visited Baghdad and met with Fazi al-Kawuchi, who agreed to contribute men to the ensuing rebellion. Fazi was from Lebanon and served in the Ottoman army during the Great War. He supported Faisal's uprising in Syria in 1920, but ended up joining the Syrian Legion. But during the Great Syrian Revolt in 1925, he deserted, and he was later invited to the newly established Saudi Arabia to train their army in Hejaz. But he was unimpressed with the Saudis and eventually made his way to Iraq, where he would meet Amin al-Hussaini. Fazi reached out to former colleagues in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq to assemble his force, stealing British uniforms and collecting weapons from sympathizers. After crossing into Palestine, Fazi made a declaration in local newspapers, calling on all Arabs to band together to drive out the British and Jews. He was identified as the commander-in-chief of the Arab Revolt of southern Syria. Since the outbreak of riots in Jaffa, more Arab bandits and militias began to appear across rural Palestine, and Fazi would meet with the leaders of the biggest bands, convincing them to fold their own force into his own. He then divided them into 4 groups by nationality: Iraqis, Syrians, Druze, and Palestinians. They began to ambush British patrols, who had to call in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The rebels managed to shoot down 2 aircraft while only losing 9 men. Up to this point, the rebellion was being led largely by, urban workers in the cities, whereas it was being led by peasants in the countryside. Bafazi's leadership gave the rebellion an air of respectability amongst the Arab notables, who began to provide material support. Arab gangs murdered Jews living in urban areas, such as killing people leaving a movie theater in Jerusalem in May 1936, which was praised by Khalil al-Sakakini. There is no other heroism like this. Another Arab opened fire on a Jewish police officer in Jerusalem a few weeks later, who was killed in a firefight with a British officer. That Arab was Sami al-Ansari, a cousin of Musa Alami. Most of the attacks by Arab gangs used landmines, bombs, and gunfire, usually occurring in isolated areas such as country roads and kibbutzim. Even Jewish majority areas like Tel Aviv were subject to sporadic attacks. Both the Jewish Agency and the British Colonial Office concluded that this was a deliberate plot to create a state of fear by targeting Jewish and British leaders. On May 11th, a bomb went off next to the home of the Arab mayor of Haifa, who had shown solidarity with the Jews who had fled Arab neighborhoods. The Arab Higher Committee continued to increase pressure on Arab Palestinians to politically and culturally conform, regardless of religious background, which resulted in the Arab and Jewish communities growing more segregated. Rebel leaders began enforcing their own dress codes on the areas they controlled, forcing citizens to give up their Ottoman fez and wear the keffiyeh. Wearing the old style of clothes became associated with supporting the British or the Nashashibi clan, who were rivals to the Hussainis. Commissioner Walkup asked the British government to appoint a royal commission of inquiry to examine the disturbances in Jaffa and examine potential future hotspots. The British government agreed, but would only send the commission once order was restored. But things would get worse before they got better. The strikes would create opportunities for the Zionists to become even more economically independent. The Jaffa port was almost completely dependent on Jewish trade and immigration, although no Jew was allowed to work there. When it was closed, the Jewish Agency executive demanded that the High Commissioner do one of 2 things: open the Jaffa port, or permit Jews to open a port in Tel Aviv. He did not want to open the Jaffa port by force, which would have caused bloodshed, and agreed that the Jews be allowed to develop a port in Tel Aviv. Walkup had initially asked the Jewish Agency to send Jewish workers to operate the Jaffa port, but Ben-Gurion refused, given Jaffa's reputation and not wanting to incite more violence. Jews fled towns like Jaffa, Haifa, and Hebron, and relocated to Tel Aviv. Arab violence resulted in the Jews hiring even fewer Arab workers than they already were. This also led to some internal protectionism within the Jewish community, where they would found numerous organizations that would basically police the Jewish community, saying, hey, you're not buying Arab products, are you? Or you're not selling Arab-made products. You need to be selling Jewish-made products. Zionist leaders urged restraint amongst the Jews, believing it would earn them more sympathy from the British and international community. But as assaults on Jews became more frequent, it became harder to justify. Jews kept getting killed to the point where the Haganah demanded Ben-Gurion to order reprisal attacks, but he refused. The revisionists began clamoring for retaliation and eventually formed their own militia, the National Military Organization, or Etzel, but they are best known as the Irgun, and it was co-founded by Chaim Shalom Halevi and Ze'ev Jabotinsky. They originated as a sub-faction within the Haganah, but as the revolt went on and Ben-Gurion refused to approve retaliatory strikes, they would eventually split off on their own and wreak their own havoc upon innocent Arabs. Despite negotiations between Ben-Gurion and the Arab moderates falling apart, the agency would continue their efforts. In June of 1936, Moshe Sharet was sent to discuss the same proposals with Musa Alami, but he was upset with how Jewish newspapers were treating the Arab cause. Jewish newspapers continued to report the assaults and atrocities committed against Jews by Arabs, and the Grand Mufti was the central villain of their stories. When meeting with Moshe Sharet, Musa Alami complained about this vilification, asserting that any lasting peace agreement would have to involve the Mufti. He claimed that Amin was more tolerant than his public pronouncements would suggest, but at this time Jewish newspapers were also accusing the Mufti and the Arab rebels of being armed and funded by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Weizmann was convinced that the Axis powers were sending arms and funds to the Arab rebels. England was refusing to admit, at least publicly, that Axis encouragement and Axis money were playing a part in the Palestine riots. Up in Syria, there were some Arab politicians who believed that the Zionists held significantly more sway over the French government than they actually did. The agency would secretly send officials up to Damascus to speak with them, hoping they could intervene with the Palestinians. But by the fall of 1936, the Syrians had secured their own independence agreement with France, and thus no longer needed the alleged influence of the Zionists. Chaim Weizmann met with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri Said in London in June of 1936. Said told Weizmann that the solution to the conflict was the creation of a large Arab federation, including Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, with certain autonomy granted to the Jewish community. He then asked Weizmann to get the agency to drastically slow down or halt Jewish immigration. Weizmann actually agreed to propose a 1-year halt on Jewish immigration in order to ease tensions. This offer would have been extremely controversial, as more to unlimited Jewish immigration was the top priority of the Zionist movement, even more so than a Jewish state. Ben-Gurion was also in London at the time, and had warned Weizmann not to make this offer. Nouri Said told the British ambassador to Baghdad about the proposal before Weizmann could speak with the British. The ambassador relayed the message back to London, resulting in Colonial Secretary Ormsby Gore to ask Weizmann for a clarification. When meeting with other Zionists, Weizmann denied making the offer, but Ben-Gurion was still suspicious. Weizmann would send letters to Ormsby Gore and the Baghdad ambassador, giving his version of the discussion with Said. Said would meet with Moshe Sharet and made the same proposal, but it was also rejected. At the end of June, over 130 Arab officials and judges in the Mandate government submitted a memo to the High Commissioner, which said, "The underlying cause of the present discontent in the Arab population of all classes, creeds, and occupations is animated by a profound sense of injustice. As a result, the Arabs have been driven into a state verging on despair, and the present unrest is no more than an expression of that despair. We have no hesitation in recommending the stoppage of immigration as the only fair, humane, and honorable solution to the deadlock. We must conscientiously raise a protest against the present policy of repression." Between late spring and summer, Arab bands formed in the countryside where it was easier to conduct hit-and-run attacks, as well as commit sabotage against telephone lines, railways, electrical grids, and the oil pipeline to Iraq. They also attacked kibbutzim in Samaria and the Galilee. Most Jewish deaths were the result of Arab assailants, whereas most Arab deaths were the results of fighting with British police and soldiers. They implemented emergency measures such as charging collective fines on whole villages and cities, forcibly reopening businesses that closed for the strike, demolishing the homes of suspected insurgents, and establishing internment camps. Being found with an unlicensed weapon could get you sent to prison for 5 years, while acts of sabotage or firing on troops or police was life in prison or death. When searching for insurgents, the British would vandalize property and slaughter livestock, euphemistically referred to as Turkish methods. The Mandate government received complaints from Arabs. "This is not an appeal for mercy, but for justice and right. We refuse to believe that honest Britishers do not exist in this country." But most of the complaints also alleged that the British were under the influence or control of the Zionists. One British official, Alan Sigrist, raided the office of the Arab newspaper Al-Difa in Jaffa, injuring dozens of staffers. He had British officers conduct humiliation operations, forcing residents of Arab neighborhoods to salute them as they passed by. An Arab who attempted to assassinate him was killed, and local Arab newspapers proclaimed him a martyr. The government retaliated by blowing up 200 buildings in Jaffa, despite the attack occurring in Jerusalem. The police claimed that this was a sanitation measure to get rid of homes that were unsafe for human habitation, but in reality, they were clearing away narrow streets with winding alleyways that were difficult to police, leaving 6,000 Arabs homeless. When the Chief Justice of Palestine protested this act, he was removed from his post. Arabs responded to the police crackdowns by scattering nails across roads to pop the tires of police cars, and Arab police officers refused to either clear the streets of the nails or to arrest those responsible for setting the traps. Since the beginning of the strike, the Mufti had refrained from publicly endorsing militant acts, but as the summer came, he began embracing violence as well. His office provided monetary support to the fighters and made religious appeals to get Arabs to support the rebels. Imams spread allegations that the British were desecrating mosques and Qurans, as well as perpetuating hate against the Jews. The Supreme Muslim Council used Sharia court judges to funnel money to the insurgents, and the Mufti's office on the Temple Mount was stockpiling weapons and planning attacks. The British were very aware of this activity. Investigations were finding more and more evidence supporting that the Mufti was, in fact, arming the rebels. Waqf proposed deporting the Mufti. The Mufti is no real leader. I have a profound mistrust of the Mufti and all his works. I believe him to be not only bitterly anti-Jewish, but also anti-British and a rascal. But they refrained from entering the compound for fear of inflaming Muslim resentment further. The revolt escalated again in August 1936, when Fawzi finally crossed the border into Palestine with 300 men. It's around this time that those within the Mandate government began secretly reaching out to neighboring Arab governments to intervene. It was all in the true spirit of appeasement. Violence continued to escalate. Fawzi provided needed strategic thinking, which meant he was more likely to make strategic ceasefires with the British for the purpose of preserving his fighting force. Fawzi was so competent at organizing the Palestinian militias that one author blames him for why the Palestinians were never able to develop their own military hierarchy. Kawukji's rashness to act practically killed the project of forming a centralized army at birth. Arab bands killed off-duty soldiers as well as tearing down trees on Jewish properties. Arab collaborators were also being targeted, as well as those who were merely suspected of collaborating. The acting mayor of Haifa was assassinated for his perceived willingness to work with Jews, along with the head of Haifa's National Committee. Mosques refused to provide Islamic burial rights to those who worked for the Mandate government. The cemeteries that did agree to bury their bodies had to have police stationed at the graves for fear that the rebels would dig up and mutilate them. Thanks to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and Germany reoccupying the Rhineland, the British were short on manpower, so the Mandate government began arming and training Jewish communities for self-defense, establishing the Notrim. However, they weren't given access to the newest weaponry, so most of them had to make do with hunting rifles and anything else they could get their hands on. But as the violence continued to escalate, the British would have to send reinforcements. The British sent another division of troops to Palestine in September of 1936, bringing the total number of troops to 20,000, and created a new position, General Officer Commanding, and appointed John Dill to that post. Dill asked Waqf to enact martial law in order to crush the insurgency, but the High Commissioner refused, not wanting to anger the Arabs further. Waqf hoped that the revolt would run out of steam before martial law was necessary. By October, some of the Arab strikers were getting weary. Farmers needed workers to harvest their crops before they rotted, and the Mufti was receiving less money and arms from Arabs due to the shutdown in economic activity. Not wanting to stop the strike and lose face, Amin secretly reached out to Arab kings in the region to provide funds and arms. The courts of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Jordan did, while simultaneously publishing a letter calling on Palestine's Arabs to end the fighting and trust the British. As it turns out, this letter had been secretly written by the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab strike did not cause any damage to the Jewish economy. On the contrary, the number of Jewish workers in the villages grew from 5,000 to 6,000 in 1936 to 12,000 at the end of the year. Jewish agriculture production grew. Not one Jewish settlement was abandoned. Instead, new ones were established. The damage to the Arab economy, however, was tremendous. The general strike was hardly effective where the rival community proved more than happy to provide services formerly provided by the Arabs. Success was contingent on the ability of the Arab Higher Committee to control, direct, and ultimately stop the violence in return for political concessions. The British had resisted reaching out to neighboring Arab countries since the mandate was their responsibility, but they took this opportunity to end the revolt. The League of Nations, however, was angry, seeing it as overriding their authority. The chair of the League's Permanent Mandates Commission said this of the British decision. From that time forward, what could rightly be considered as a local problem had become the center of a vast international problem. On October 12, 1936, the Arab Higher Committee declared the strike over and stopped funneling arms and money to armed groups. But they secretly contacted rebel leaders. Honored reverends, heroes, our poor tongues cannot express the strength of our love and admiration and the exaltation concealed in our hearts for your self-sacrifice and your devoted war for religion, fatherland, and all things Arab. We stand now in a period of hope and expectation. If the Royal Commission comes and judges equitably and gives us all our rights, well and good. If not, the field of battle lies before us. Several days later, the Mufti convinced Fawzi to leave Palestine. Walkup had promised the Arab kings that he wouldn't disarm or pursue the militants or their commanders as they returned home. Fawzi ordered that no attacks be waged against Jews as he left, but he did leave behind a manifesto. "O Britishers, I am enemy number one of great despair to those who serve the Zionists, and friend number one of great faithfulness to any just and honorable Englishman who values Great Britain and her noble ally the Arab people. I beg you to shout in the faces of some of your politicians to give justice to the Palestinian Arabs and grant them their demands. You will find then, on the part of this Arab people of glorious history, nothing but friendship, devotion, and assistance, which you will never find among the Zionists." After 6 months, officials estimated the death toll was about 80 Jews, 28 British, and 200 Arabs. However, they acknowledged that the Arab body count was likely closer to 1,000, and the rebellion had cost £3.5 million to put down. Although the Arabs had to call off the strike, they had one major success, which is still standing to this day. The conflict between Jews and Arabs in the Levant was made an international issue rather than a local one. A coup in October of 1936 had deposed the Pan-Arabist government in Iraq and replaced it with a nationalist one. When Jewish agency representatives visited Baghdad in February 1937, they were told that Iraq was done with the Palestine issue, having wasted 17 years on it while neglecting domestic concerns. One of the agency reps recounted an Iraqi politician saying to him, "Neither us nor any other Arab country should carry 2 watermelons in one hand. Each and every Arab state should concentrate, at least for the next 20 years, on self-consolidation and only then concern itself with the affairs of its neighbors. Our brothers, the Palestinian Arabs, claim that during these 20 years they will be swamped by the Zionists. This may or may not be true, yet one must not sacrifice the interests of the entire Arab East for the sake of a small Arab community totaling some 800 to 900,000 people. Palestine is no dearer to the Arab world than Lebanon, which our Syrian brothers agreed to leave in its Christian character. If the Christians are allowed to form their own government in a small part of the Arab East, surely the Jews have no lesser a right to do so." Musa Alami had spent most of this period in Europe. In September, he delivered a letter from the Mufti to Benito Mussolini, in which he asked for weapons and assistance in sabotaging the Iraqi pipeline to Haifa. He then met with Mussolini's foreign minister, Galeazzo Ciano. They orchestrated a money laundering scheme in which money would be sent to a middleman in Beirut, who would deliver the funds to the Mufti. But the Arabs were not alone in meeting with the Italians. In 1934, Chaim Weizmann had met with Mussolini, hoping to influence the Italian chairman of the League of Nations Mandate Commission. Weizmann appealed to Mussolini's desire to weaken the British position in the Near East, and discussed a possible settlement for Palestine, dividing the territory into cantons like Switzerland. Mussolini went so far as to propose a fully Jewish state. "You must create a Jewish state. I have already spoken with the Arabs. The Arabs saw the just must have their capital in Tel Aviv." Weizmann replied, "The idea you raised is a great one. When we reach the state of practicalities, can I count on your support?" "Certainly, very wise." I carried away the impression that Mussolini was not hostile to the Zionist idea, or to our work in Palestine. His suspicion and hostility were directed at the British, who in his opinion were using the Jews in the eastern Mediterranean in order to cut across the Italian control of Mare Nostrum. The violence having subsided, the Royal Commission could finally be sent to Palestine to investigate the riots in Jaffa, and now the greater conflict. It was chaired by Lord William Peel. The Colonial Secretary authorized a 6-month quota for Jewish immigrants to Palestine, restricting it to 1,800. Despite this being a drastic reduction, the Mufti was still angry, and refused to cooperate with the commission if Jewish immigration wasn't completely stopped, and threatened to restart the strike. Arab leaders tried to change his mind. Ibn Saud said it was a mistake, as did the Nashibi and Husseini clans, along with Musa Alami, Yusuf Hanna, and Fawzi, while King Abdullah of Jordan said he was throwing moderates under the bus. But Amin had a keen instinct for the popular attitudes of the Arabs of Palestine, and those who cooperated with the Peel Commission would face ostracism. Ormsby Gore told Anthony Eden that the Mufti was chief villain of the peace, and that they should try and get rid of him. On November 6th, the Arab Higher Committee announced the boycott. In relation to the decision of the British government not to stop Jewish immigration, this is contrary to what the Arabs had been expecting, i.e., a complete stoppage of all forms of immigration. whereas the strike which was declared by the Arabs and which continued for 6 months was nothing but a protest against the policy of the British government, which deprives the Arabs of their political rights. Therefore, the committee denounces with vigor this stand and decides not to cooperate with the Royal Commission and asks the honorable nation, which has proved to the world at large its political maturity and strong national faith, to abide by this decision, and may God arrange matters. The Peel Commission would stay at the King David Hotel and hold hearings at a nearby government building. Chaim Weizmann was a star witness for the commission, testifying 5 times. I spoke of the 6 million Jews pent up in places where they are not wanted, and for whom the world is divided into places where they cannot live and places they may not enter. A certificate for Palestine is the highest boon. When one speaks of the Jewish people, one speaks of a people which is a minority everywhere, a majority nowhere, which is to some extent identified with the races among which it lives, but still not quite identical. It is a disembodied ghost of a race, and it inspires suspicion, and suspicion breeds hatred. There should be one place in the world, in God's wide world, where we could live and express ourselves in accordance with our character, and make our contribution to civilization in our own way, and through our own channels. During his other testimonies, Weizmann called the Arabs greedy, talking about how they had already gotten 3 large kingdoms out of the Great War, and yet still begrudged the Jews living in Palestine. The British Commission told Weizmann that it would be the Jews' job to civilize the Arabs, and that the Arab would not like it, and it would take a very long time. At first, Weizmann did not propose an independent Jewish state, but a system of parity with equal power and representation for both Jews and Arabs. During their 4th interview with Weizmann, the commissioners proposed a division, a Jewish and Arab canton, with neutral areas controlled by neither. Weizmann did not endorse the plan, pointing out that many Jews living outside the Jewish canton would be ghettoized. However, he implied that he would be open to such a solution if Jewish immigration was allowed to continue. Weizmann would also tell the commission, "The underlying cause is that we exist, and the only question you have to answer is, have we a right to exist? If you answer the question positively, everything flows from it. I have tried to cut out the core and tell you the truth. I have said all I have to say. I can add no more. I cannot plead harder than I have done. Here it is. Take it or leave it." The commission introduced the concept of partition to Weizmann in a session on January 8, 1937. I was asked how the idea struck me, and naturally answered that I could not tell on the spur of the moment, nor would I give my own impressions except after consultation with my colleagues. Actually, I felt the suggestion held out great possibilities and hopes. Something new had been born into the Zionist movement, something which had to be handled with great care and tenderness. One of the commissioners, Professor Copeland, suggested a partition of Palestine, a Jewish state with the remaining Arab lands being annexed into Jordan. This was the first mention of a 2-state solution by a British official. Weizmann didn't endorse the idea and again pointed to the complications of dividing such a small land in 2. However, he said if there was unanimous agreement and peace was involved, the Zionists would consider it. In private, however, Weizmann was ecstatic at the proposal. A few days later, Weizmann met privately with Copeland, where they discussed various versions of a partition plan. One of the plans offered the Jews part of the Negev, while another gave them the Galilee instead. Weizmann also spoke with activists from the various factions of Zionism to get their take on partition. I saw in the establishment of a Jewish state a real possibility of coming to terms with the Arabs. As long as the mandatory policy prevails, the Arabs are afraid that we shall absorb the whole of Palestine. Say what we will about the preservation of their rights, they are dominated by fear and will not listen to reason. The commission would interview 80 people, but only Britons and Jews because the Arabs were boycotting the process. The Arab kings, along with the Hashibi clan, implored the Mufti to get involved, fearing that the panel would come out with a pro-Zionist proposal if they weren't. Just days before the commission was scheduled to leave, the Mufti ended the boycott. The Jewish Agency had been in secret communications with King Abdullah of Jordan for years, and Moshe Sharet met with him in November 1936 and appealed to him to intervene with the Mufti and the Arabs. Instead, Abdullah urged the agency to slow down Jewish immigration due to the Arabs being incapable of accepting transformation of any part of Palestine into a Jewish state. He did not advocate the expulsion of the Jews so long as they remained loyal subjects to him, but he couldn't accept them as more than a third of the population. King Abdullah was the first Arab to testify, doing so in Amman. In his testimony, he condemned the Balfour Declaration and British policy up to that point. He was willing to let the Jews who were already in Palestine stay, but that they must not be allowed to be more than one-third of the population. Abdullah was also interested in annexing all or part of Palestine as well as Syria into Jordan, and was willing to work with the British if this could make it happen. And for years by this point, he had been in secret contact with the Jewish Agency, who gave him tips on what to say to the British in order to get what he wanted. The commission interviewed the Mufti in mid-January 1937. The Mufti said the mandate was illegitimate and that the Balfour Declaration contradicted the League of Nations' commitment to self-determination. He said that Jewish nationalism threatened Muslim holy sites and claimed that sites like the Western Wall were a purely Muslim place. He also accused the Jews of wanting to destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple, and accused the British government of being under the control of the Zionists. My experience up till now shows that the Jews can do anything as far as Palestine is concerned. The people who have persuaded a great government like Great Britain to destroy the integrity of an Arab people in order to replace it by their own can easily do that, especially when they become the majority in the country. It is impossible to place two distinct peoples who differ from each other in every sphere of their life in one and the same country. He told the commission that creating a Jewish home in Palestine would create perpetual violence and demanded that the mandate be terminated, the Balfour Declaration renounced, all Jewish immigration be ceased, and a ban on land sales to Jews. When the commission asked him what would happen to the 400,000 Jews already living in Palestine, the Mufti said, "We must leave all this to the future." And when asked if his independent Palestine could assimilate the Jews, he gave a quick and terse no. Since you demanded the establishment of a national government in Palestine, what will you do with the 400,000 Jews already living there? It will not be the first time Jews have lived under the aegis of an Arab state. In the past, it has been the Arab states which were the more compassionate to them. History shows that, during all periods, the Jews only found rest under the protection of Arab rulers. The East was always shelter for Jews escaping from European pressure. You stated that the number of Jews has increased steeply, so that the number of Arabs, which during the time of conquest was approximately 90% of the total population, has now dropped to 70%. That is correct. Notwithstanding this, if you reach agreement with the English, will you be prepared to allow the Jews to remain in the country? This is a matter for the government that will be formed to deal with at the appropriate time. Its principle will be justice, and above all else, it will concern itself with the interest and benefit of the country. Do you think the Jews will accept this declaration without receiving something more substantial? Such an oral declaration will not convince them. Jews living in other Arab states currently enjoy freedoms and rights. I feel I can safely assume what the Jews will have to say on this matter. Does His Eminence think that this country can assimilate and digest 400,000 Jews now in the country? No. Some of them would have to be removed by a process, kindly or painfully, as the case may be. We must leave all this to the future. The conversation wasn't over. You complain that there are too many Jews. Would they be safe in an Arab Palestine? That would depend on the Arab government. You think they would be able to persuade the mandatory power to destroy those mosques and to erect a temple? I know they have already demolished mosques in villages which were acquired by them. Might I repeat my question? It was whether His Eminence thinks that the Jews have so much influence within the mandatory power that they would be able to persuade them to allow them to pull down, for instance, the Mosque of Aqsa and to erect a temple? I do not imagine that the British government would do that itself, but the people who have proclaimed a great government like Great Britain to adopt a policy like the Balfour Declaration can do many things. We want it clear. The suggestion is that although the British government was still the mandatory and still bound by those articles of the mandate, that the power of the Jews would somehow imperil the British government till the Muslim holy places were desecrated or removed. I would like to answer quite frankly. If this question were put to me, I would say definitely no. But if I say no now, I will not be true to myself, because according to my information and experience, I know that the Jews have great influence in England. So the answer is yes. As far as the resulting consequences are concerned, the answer is yes. The Peel report commented on this exchange. We are not questioning the sincerity or humanity of the Mufti's intentions and those of his colleagues, but we cannot forget what recently happened, despite treaty provisions and explicit assurances to the Assyrian minority in Iraq. Nor can we forget that the hatred of the Arab population for the national home has never been concealed, and that it has now permeated the Arab population as a whole.
I actually talked about this in a previous video. Basically, the Iraqi government had made some assurances to the Assyrian Christian community in northern Iraq that they would be protected. But the Iraqi military encouraged the Kurds to basically go on an ethnic cleansing spree of the Assyrians in 1931. And so that is what they are referring to.
Most of the Arabs interviewed made similar statements to those of the Mufti, claiming they would not give up 1 meter of land nor allow a single additional Jew into the country, and refused to negotiate with them. One Arab testimony quoted in the report said, "You say my house has been enriched by the strangers who have entered it, but it is my house, and I did not invite the strangers in, or ask them to enrich it. I do not care how poor or bare it is if only I am master in it." Anthony Eden and Walkup both called the Arab testimonies crude, rude, and self-defeating. They saw the Mufti as a radicalizing force among the Arabs, but Musa Alami, once an apologist for the Mufti, agreed with the comments. The last Arab witness was George Antonius. He accused the British of treating Jewish and Arab nationalists differently. He claimed that the Arab opposition to Zionism wasn't rooted in anti-Semitism or inability to compromise, but that the desire for independence could not accommodate compromise. He expressed sympathy for the plight of Jews in Europe, but said, "If that relief is to be obtained only at the expense of inflicting corresponding distress on another people, the people of this country, then no, it cannot be done."
The commission report would say this about the general attitude of the Arabs.
Though the Arabs have benefited by the development of the country owing to Jewish immigration, this has had no conciliatory effect. On the contrary, with almost mathematical precision, the betterment of the economic situation in Palestine meant the deterioration of the political situation. They called on a number of witnesses back in Britain. Winston Churchill would also be interviewed by the commission in London.
"We owe to the Jews in the Christian revelation a system of ethics which, even if it were entirely separated from the supernatural, would be incomparably the most precious possession of mankind, worth in fact the fruits of all other wisdom and learning put together. On that system, and by that faith, there has been built out of the wreck of the Roman Empire the whole of our existing civilization."
Some have accused Churchill's Judeophile statements as being purely practical politics, but he has a long history of these philo-Semitic statements.
Some people like Jews, and some do not, but no thoughtful man can doubt that they are beyond all question the most formidable and the most remarkable race which has ever appeared in the world.
Churchill's primary criticism of the Jewish Agency was its Hebrew-only labor policy, believing incorporating more Arab labor would have ameliorated much of the animosity toward the Jews. He believed that the Jews were generating more wealth in the region that would benefit everybody.
"Why is there harsh injustice done if people come in and make a livelihood for more and make the desert into palm groves and orange groves? Why is it injustice because there is more work and wealth for everybody? There is no injustice. The injustice has been those who live in the country leave it to be a desert for thousands of years."
They also interviewed Jabotinsky. His testimony agreed with Weizmann's. The problem was that the Jews were a minority and were on the precipice of annihilation. His main difference with Weizmann was the solution, a sovereign Jewish state, encompassing all of Palestine. The phenomenon called Zionism may include all kinds of dreams, a model community, Hebrew culture, perhaps even a second edition of the Bible. But all this longing for wonderful toys of velvet and silver is nothing in comparison with the tangible momentum of irresistible distress and need by which we are propelled.
The commission had come to the conclusion that the mandate as it was not salvageable, and that partition was the only way forward.
The commission would propose a partition of Palestine, but they didn't have an expert on the land to draw up lines, so they enlisted an irrigation expert, Douglas Gordon Harris. He had spent most of his career in India, but had spent the last year drawing up a cantonization scheme for Palestine. His testimony to the commission said that both cantonization and federation were both unworkable. He showed the commissioners a map that divided the Arab and Jewish lands by a green line, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem excluded from either. He proposed a population transfer to resettle Arabs who were in the Jewish state and Jews who were in the Arab state. If the Jews try to oppress the Arabs in the Jewish state, there shall be reprisals on the other side, and the mere fact that reprisals are possible will probably keep them from being unduly oppressive. Harris's proposed division of Palestine, despite giving the Arabs more territory, would not be economically equal due to the sheer economic power of Tel Aviv. To alleviate this, his plan incorporated an annual payment or subvention from the Jewish state to the Arab one. He believed that the Jewish state would form alliances with neighboring Arab states who needed their technology and capital. The main conflict he saw coming was that the neighboring Arab countries would occasionally send small raids across the Jewish state's borders, which he believed a Jewish army could deal with. Professor Kuplan was enthusiastic about the proposal. The commission would speak with Louis Andrews, who acted as a liaison to the Arabs. They asked him if the Arabs would accept Harris's plan. Andrews told them that the moderates would, but that most of them would be too fearful of reprisals from the extremists to publicly voice support.
Despite the secrecy of writing the report, Professor Kuplan's off-hours consultation with Weizmann resulted in the news of partition being leaked before the report was published, which led both sides of the issue to begin trying to lay the groundwork to either reject or affirm the decision based on what the exact wording of the report would be.
In April 1937, Ben-Gurion went to Lebanon to secretly meet Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Fuad Hamza, in order to assess the Saudi government's attitudes on the issue. But the discussions were inconclusive, with Hamza avoiding making any commitments. In May, Ben-Gurion went to London to meet with John Philby, a former colonial official who had converted to Islam and was an advisor to Ibn Saud. Philby made the same Pan-Arab Federation proposal most others had, allowing for a Jewish autonomous province, but by this point Ben-Gurion had been burned too many times. In May of 1937, Moshe Sharet met with Abd el-Hadi, telling the latter that the commission was most likely going to endorse a partition. Sharet and many other Zionists opposed this because they wanted the whole of Palestine as a Jewish state, and sought to work out an Arab-Jewish agreement before the British could impose a solution neither of them wanted. But by this point it was too late. The report would be published on July 7, 1937.
The report was overall pro-Zionist in tone in that it blamed most of the failures of the mandate on the Arabs' insistence on using violence.
An irrepressible conflict has arisen between two national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. About 1 million Arabs are in strife, open or latent, with some 400,000 Jews. There is no common ground between them. The Arab community is predominantly Asiatic in character, the Jewish community predominantly European. They differ in religion and in language. Their cultural and social life, their ways of thought and conduct, are as incompatible as their national aspirations. The report asserts religious motivations being the primary driving force behind Zionism, but claims it was mostly embraced by secularized Jews in Western Europe, where they were not in danger. Zionism, on its negative side, is a creed of escape, but not so much escape from the physical dangers as from the psychological drawbacks of Jewish life in the diaspora. It appealed, indeed, with special force to emancipated intellectual Jews in Western countries where their life and liberty were perfectly secure. It reviewed the economic conditions of the mandate and found that the overall material conditions of the whole population, including the Arabs, was higher than before. The economic position of the Arabs as a whole continued to improve. Markets for country produce expanded, more roads and bridges and schools were built, and in due course the new measures determined on in 1930 for safeguarding and advancing Arab interests came into operation. The Arab reaction to this sudden and striking development was quite natural. All these Jewish men and women, all this Jewish money pouring into Palestine might mean more prosperity for Arabs as well as Jews, though even that measure of consolation they refused to admit. The report found that not only were Arab tenants evicted by Jewish landowners offered an opportunity to resettle by the agency itself, but the Mandate government had its own program to resettle evicted Arabs at no cost to them. Numerous laws were passed to protect Arabs from eviction. Attempts at creating intercommunal societies failed because the Jews already had their own cooperative groups established.
The report stated that the Arabs' complaint weren't about the Mandate's policies, but rather about its mere existence.
They frankly stated that they do not rest their case upon these grievances, but that their quarrel is with the existence of the Mandate itself. They do not accept the interpretation of the McMahon letter. They deny the validity of the Balfour Declaration. They have never admitted the right of the powers to entrust a mandate to Great Britain. The point which concerns us here is not whether these Arabs' claims are justified or not, but simply that they are their claims and that the overriding or settling aside of them was the main cause of the disturbances.
The Arabs in Palestine were upset that all of the neighboring Arab countries now had independent governments with their own legislatures and elected officials and monarchs, while they didn't. And they were also upset that they were now a smaller proportion of the population within Palestine. And they saw this reduction in their proportion of the population as a violation of their human rights.
The fear of Jewish domination, political and economic. The Arabs were afraid of the Jews. They are impressed and alarmed by their pertinacity, their wealth, their ability in growing numbers. They view with mistrust the extent of land which has passed into Jewish hands. If they have fears for themselves, these fears are multiplied 1,000-fold for their children, whose whole future seem to be threatened by the advancing tide of Jewish immigrants. No doubt, too, among these less educated Arabs at any rate, the fear is widespread that Jewish domination might affect the holy places and influence the freedom of religious observance. Both parties submitted proposals. The Arab Higher Committee wanted national independence with full sovereignty over all internal and external affairs, including immigration. And the report was skeptical about the Arab Higher Committee's claim that they would protect the rights of Jews. The Arab Higher Committee assured us that the welfare of the Jewish minority would be safeguarded not only by specific provisions in the treaty, which would accompany the grant of independence, but also by the habitual toleration which Jewish minorities have enjoyed in other Arab lands. But it must be remembered that those Jewish minorities elsewhere are relatively very small, and that the Jewish minority in Palestine is already regarded by the Arabs as too big. Jabotinsky's solution was to give the entirety of both Palestine and Jordan to the Jews, and allow unlimited immigration so that they became the majority population.
These passages are a fitting summary of the report's overall conclusions.
This intensification of the conflict will continue. The estranging force of conditions inside Palestine is growing year by year. The educational systems, Arab and Jewish, are schools of nationalism, and they have only existed for a short time. The more numerous and prosperous and better educated the Arabs become, the more insistent will be their demand for national independence, and the more bitter their hatred of the obstacles that bars the way to it. As the Jewish national home grows older and more firmly rooted, so will grow its self-confidence and political ambition. Thus, for internal and external reasons, it seems probable that the situation, bad as it now is, will grow worse. Manifestly, the problem cannot be solved by giving either the Arabs or the Jews all they want. The answer to the question, which of them in the end will govern Palestine, must surely be neither. But while neither race can justly rule all Palestine, we see no reason why, if it were practicable, each race should not rule part of it. The report refused to shut down Jewish immigration altogether, but it did recommend drastically reducing it to 12,000 annually. It stated that immigration restrictions, cantonization, and equal government would not resolve the root of the problem. It proposed partition as the only plan with any chance of success, and the proposed map gave Jews 20% of the territory despite only owning about 7% of the land, but making up nearly a third of the population. Jerusalem and Bethlehem, with a corridor to the sea north of Jaffa, would remain under British control, and both Britain and the Jewish state would give annual payments to the Arab state. It also proposed a population transfer between the two states, following the precedent set by Turkey and Greece. The Chamberlain government would back the plan proposed by the Peel Report. Jewish leaders were ecstatic. Ben-Gurion said,
"I see in the realization of this plan an almost decisive phase in the beginning of complete redemption, and an unrivaled lever for the gradual conquest of all of the land of Israel."
A partial Jewish state is not the end, but the beginning, a powerful impetus in our historic efforts to redeem the land in its entirety.
Despite their support for the plan, the Zionists publicly acted like they did not support the plan, partly because some of them didn't support the plan, but also because it was a political strategy. If the Arabs thought the Zionists and Jews supported the plan, then the Arabs would not support it. And therefore, this was a bit of reverse psychology. It didn't work. But moderate Arabs, at first at least, did begrudgingly support it.
The Maronites in Lebanon were also supportive of the partition plan, with President Emil Ed expressing interest in signing a treaty between the soon-to-be independent Lebanon and a Jewish state. King Abdullah of Jordan expressed his support to the British, along with the former mayor of Jerusalem, along with the mayors of Nablus, Jenin, Tokarem, and Haifa as well.
Not all Jews had positive reactions to the report.
Jabotinsky was more empathetic to the Arab nationalists than Weizmann, but because of that, he was also less accommodating.
Palestine on both sides of the Jordan should hold the Arabs, their progeny, and many millions of Jews. What I do not deny is that in that process the Arabs of Palestine will necessarily become a minority. What I do not deny is that that is a hardship. That is not a hardship on any race, any nation, possessing so many national states now and so many more national states in the future. One fraction, one branch of that race, and not a big one, will have to live in someone else's state.
Despite all of that, he still opposed the proposed population transfers.
The Commission's report describes me as an extremist, but at least I never dreamt of demanding the Arab inhabitants of the Jewish state to emigrate. This might be a most dangerous precedent which will jeopardize the interests of the Jewish diaspora. Nor will the prospective Arab state, once deprived of Jewish energy and capital, following the transfer of its Jewish inhabitants as suggested by the Peel report, be able to absorb these Arabs. Hence the notion of uprooting masses of people is nothing but idle talk.
The 20th Zionist Congress was held in Zurich in August of 1937. Weizmann voiced his support for partition, but expressed a desire to redo the borders more in their favor. He would say this about the Arabs: "We know that the Mufti and Kabuchi are not the Arab nation. There is an Arab nation with a glorious past. To that nation we have stretched out our hand, and do so even now, but on one condition. Just as we wish them to overcome their crisis, and to revert to the great tradition of the mighty and civilized Arab people, so must they know that we have the right to build our home in Eretz Israel, harming no one, helping all. When they acknowledge this, we shall reach common ground." The wider Zionist movement opposed the partition, believing that all of Palestine should belong to the Jews, especially Jerusalem. They also feared that such a small state would be territorially indefensible.
There were other Zionists who opposed the partition.
Along with Winston Churchill and the leadership of the Liberal and Labour parties, former High Commissioner Herbert Samuel published an article in Foreign Affairs outlining his problems with the proposal. The Commission seemed to have picked out all the most awkward provisions of the Peace Treaty of Versailles, and to have put a Saar, a Polish corridor, and half a dozen Danzigs and Memels into a country the size of Wales. The US State Department voiced its concerns over the plan. "We were constantly being pressured for action by the nearly 5 million Jews in the United States. At the same time, our representatives in the Near Eastern Arab countries, plus our own military officials here, were informing us of the danger of antagonizing the 60 million Arabs." The Mufti was enraged at the partition plan and resumed his campaign of demonizing the Jews. A minority of intruders, who before the war had no great standing in this country, and whose political connections therewith had been served for almost 2,000 years, such an attempt is without precedent in history, ancient or modern. Palestine is still an Arab country, because the majority of its population is Arab, the majority of its property owners are Arabs, and because of its unbroken historical connection with the Arabs for over 1,400 years.
The Arab Palestinians were angry at the report and rejected it outright.
King Abdullah was the only Arab monarch to approve the plan, due to the plan involving Jordan annexing the Arab portions of Palestine. The Nashashibi clan initially supported the plan, but after an intimidation campaign led by the Husseini clan, they fell silent or renounced the report. The government of Neville Chamberlain supported the partition proposal, which made Amin decide to stop trying to persuade the British, and decided to openly support revolt. Despite having said months earlier that Iraq was done wasting time on Palestine, when the report was published, Prime Minister Hikmat Suleiman became a leading voice in the struggle, so vehement that Iraq's ambassador in London was dressed down by Anthony Eden in the Foreign Office. But Suleiman was quickly followed by most of the Arab states. But the Arab states were not just concerned for the Palestinians' own sake. They also didn't like the idea of Jordan annexing large chunks of Palestine. The Mufti met with the German consul to ask Germany to more loudly oppose a Jewish state, and then moved his household into the offices at the Temple Mount, which the British authorities had not been willing to enter for fear of inciting Arab riots. The Mufti began reaching out to Arab states for more support. He went so far as to demand Ibn Saud to have the ulama of Mecca declare a jihad on the Jews. Many delegates, including Golda Meir, didn't believe the British would actually go through with it. The Congress would come to a compromise in which it would accept the overall plan of partition, but rejected the borders as proposed by the Peel Report. The Grand Mufti convened his own summit in Damascus of the Arab parties to respond to the report's proposal. Their meeting would emphasize the promised Arab state given by the Allies in the Great War, and accuse the British of succumbing to Zionist money, and that the Arabs would shift their allegiances to other European powers whose goals were in line with their own. They declared that it was the duty of all Arabs and Muslims to fight as one and boycott a Jewish state, and all that didn't were de facto Zionists. Arab propaganda proliferated, calling Jews enemies of the Prophet and servants of Satan. The conference would ask God to grant them victory in their jihad. Some attendees felt the conference didn't go far enough, and wanted it to explicitly commit to relaunch acts of violence. A quarter of the delegates to this conference would meet up in Damascus again in secret, and plot a return to violence, targeting the British, the Jews, and Arabs still on friendly terms with either. A letter from Fawzi said that if partition was to go through, every Arab should die for the cause to stop it. The area of Galilee had been assigned to the Jewish state in the partition plan, but at that time it was still majority Arab. So the Jewish Agency and the National Fund began buying land in the region and sending settlers to build homes. This was part of the Wall and Tower campaign, which took advantage of old permit laws the British left in place that allowed any structures built in a single day to not require a permit.
Mid-August saw a renewal of violence against Jewish communities, but this phase of the revolt also kind of dived into being a bit of a Palestinian civil war, with various clans, families, and factions using the coming violence as an excuse to settle old scores.
In September of 1937, Lewis Andrews, a British official, visited an Anglican church in Nazareth, but while there, he was assassinated by 3 Arabs who shot him 9 times. The Arab Higher Committee would issue a one-sentence condemnation of the attack, and the Arab newspaper Philistine urged the authorities to restrain themselves. But this murder would hurtle Palestine back into the throes of revolt. Thanks again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video. To get some delicious cereal, go to magicspoon.com/casual and use the promo code casual to get $5 off your order. I'd also like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Their support allows me to spend more time focusing on interesting videos and less time trying to appease the algorithm. If you would like to support these videos and get early access to videos as well as access to my scripts and notes, then check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.